So, Bob, where were you when the Pentagon Papers came out?
I was working at the Montgomery County Sentinel. I tried out at the Post 6 months earlier and failed
Oh,
the
no.
tryout. Yes, I did. I had never done journalism, but I said to the Metro editor, "Thank you." And he said, "What are you thanking me for? You failed." And I said, "Because I know this is what I want to do." As you know, there is an energy and immediacy that comes from the newsroom. And even when you try out and fail, you get infected with that.
Right.
Did that happen to you when you
Oh,
were in your
totally.
first?
Yeah, I started as a summer intern at my hometown newspaper in
That's right.
Tampa, and obviously got fascinated by the field then, and stayed with it the entire time.
Yeah.
But then you got to the Post shortly after the whole Pentagon Papers case, right?
Right, but 3 months after. But there's a Pentagon Papers story I have told, but has actually never been put together. I lived in an apartment building in Washington, maybe 5 blocks from the Post, and I had a good friend from college who clerked for Chief Justice Warren Burger. And he told me that the press had won the case 6-3. Really?
All right.
And so I thought, wow, and this is before it was announced. So I walked over to the Post, and it's before security era, and kind of went in. I said, "I'd like to talk to somebody. You guys won." And they thought I was an idiot. and no one took it seriously. I said, I have a good source. You won 6-3. And they kind of, there's some jackass in the newsroom, get him out of here.
Is that right?
And yeah, no one, I mean, this
Well, that would
is
have been your first scoop then.
it might have been,
And
yes.
it was totally
Yeah.
wasted.
Yeah, it was wasted. But there's a lesson for reporting, and that is listen to everyone.
Sure.
Really, really listen, and then you can assess whether it's true or meaningful. And the question always is this someone, when I could say, I knew a clerk who worked for Warren Burger, oh, okay, and what's his name? I could have given his name, and it would have been maybe more credible.
Right, yeah, absolutely. So then when you got into the newsroom, what was the atmosphere like at that time? They and the New York Times had won this huge case about press freedom, the ability
And
to
so
publish
had the
without prior
Washington
constraint.
Post.
Both the New York Times
Yeah.
and the Washington Post,
Yeah,
of course.
yeah.
So what was the atmosphere in the newsroom at the time?
It's an important question. It was, wow, we're coming into our own. We can do our job. Of course, the Pentagon Papers decision said no prior restraint. And that was a big win for the press and created an environment which we exploit up to today even, and that is when we have a good story, particularly if it's national security sensitive, you can go to the government and say, look, we've got this, and then they will talk or negotiate with you. You've done this a number of times,
Right.
as have I, and if you didn't have that Pentagon Papers decision, they could say, oh, you know about, Project Pink Starling? Oh, okay, off to jail with you, and if you publish it, we're going to do X or Y. So it was very liberating to the press.
Absolutely. And how do you think that it affected the newsroom at that point? Did it add a bit of swagger to the newsroom? Do you feel that it sort of elevated the position of the Post in the country, made it much more of a national news organization at the time?
One of your predecessors, Ben Bradley, was the editor, and we didn't have a swagger deficit. And so there was a feeling of, but also,
So there was already plenty of swagger in the newsroom
yeah,
at
there
that
was,
time.
but it was restrained swagger, I think. What were you in the
I was
summer of
in-
'71?
I was in high school at the time.
You were?
Yes.
And did you have any
I was
awareness
just going into
of
college.
the Pentagon?
Yeah, I was interested in journalism even
Yeah.
when I was in high school. And I was editor of my high school newspaper, and I was going into college and had the intention of studying journalism as well. So I was aware of the Pentagon Papers case, of course, very aware of Watergate, your big story, first big story. So, you know, it was something I was keenly aware of, absolutely.
And so if the Post and the Times couldn't publish the Pentagon Papers, suppose the Supreme Court had said no, would your high school newspaper have published them?
Well, as you know, the rules governing high school newspapers are a little different than the rules governing
No, but you know
newspapers.
the unstated motto we have at the Washington Post, which is all good work is done in defiance of management.
That's probably
But that doesn't
true.
mean break the rules or the law, but it means push from below. Don't you?
Absolutely.
Do you
Well,
subscribe to that?
absolutely. I mean, I think that we always have to challenge authority. I mean, that's part of who we are.
Even
is
within our own institution.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
of course. I think we have to. I mean, I think that's where good ideas come from. But certainly is the role of the press. I mean, look, I mean, that's how the First Amendment was written. You know, the rights of free speech and free press and freedom of assembly and freedom to seek redress of grievances. All of those were intended as a challenge to authority. I mean, that was the whole idea. That's why the founders wrote it. You know,
It was actually, if you look at it and think about it, it's designed to blow the lid off. Almost, you know, it almost intentionally. I
Right.
wonder if they were smart, the people who wrote. But
they were. I mean,
wonder,
Madison wrote, you know, about freely examining public characters and measures. That's how he described the First Amendment.
So now, investigative reporting now, which is very important. What's the biggest hazard? What's the biggest problem to all of the people you have out digging and so forth?
Well, I think, you know, it does relate to the Pentagon Papers case. I mean, so I think one of the hazards, certainly for people covering national security, is just the extensive level of classification of documents. I mean, things were highly classified back then, and a lot of documents were classified, like the Pentagon Papers, which I don't think justifiably should have been classified in the first place. I don't think there was any risk to national security in publishing those documents, even though the government said there was. And I think that's even more so the case today, that the government has now classified so many documents, so much information, that, you know, so when the press publishes something that's classified, it doesn't mean that it's actually a threat to national security. It just means that the government went overboard in classification.
But the government, when I was a lieutenant in the Navy, which was before I went to work for the Montgomery County Sentinel and the Post, I was a lieutenant and I worked in the Pentagon. I had classification authority. Somebody could come in with the daily newspaper and I had authority to say, oh, that's top secret. So when we say the government, it's individuals, and the way the system works, I know, is anyone can do it.
And
It's not as if the president or the CIA director is sitting there saying, oh yeah, we should classify this. It's some bozo lieutenant in the Pentagon or the CIA
Well, you weren't a
doing
bozo
it.
lieutenant, I'm sure of that.
Well,
but,
I was, yes.
but I mean, that's happened actually, where actual stories that have been published in a newspaper were later classified
Yes,
by
that's
the
right.
U.S. government.
Yeah.
It's extraordinary. They
Yeah,
had
that's
already
right.
been published, already disseminated,
So
and later
do we
classified.
agree the big problem is secret government?
I think it's a huge problem.
Yeah.
A
yeah.
huge problem.
Is it number one problem?
Well, I think certainly for covering national affairs, certainly for covering our government, I think that's probably number one.
One of the things I worry about as I'm working on a book on Trump is, and you see the daily coverage, which, by the way, I think is superb. Never perfect. There's always a better version, as we know, but a kind of chip away. It's almost like, you know, we're going to smoke out the truth approach. Is that a fair characterization of what you're trying to do?
Absolutely. You know, when we walk into our newsroom at the Post every day, we have the principles of the Post that were written in 1935, just a couple of years after Eugene Meyer had acquired the Post. And the first principle there is to ascertain the truth as nearly as the truth may be ascertained. And that's our goal. Every single day when we walk into the newsroom, that's what we try to do. And so, you know, look, there are a lot of people in possession of the truth, and there are a lot of people who would like the truth from becoming public. I mean, that was the case in the instance of the Pentagon Papers. I mean, that was a history of U.S. involvement in Vietnam going back decades from essentially the very beginning of substantial U.S. involvement in Vietnam. And the government simply did not want the public to know what that history revealed?
See, I think the government just, I've studied this a little bit in the Pentagon paper. It was a kind of a reflexive reaction. And the Solicitor General at the time actually told people later, oh, this is not serious classification. It's a bunch of people saying secret, secret, secret. And as we so well know, that's not because there's a threat to national security. It's often that people don't want to be embarrassed.
Right.
And it's also people kind of sitting around, if this isn't classified top secret, no one's going to read it. True.
Well, that may well be.
True.
Because if you describe it as classified, people are more interested.
Only secret. Oh,
but
my goodness.
I don't think that was the intent in this instance, was to get more people to read it. I think it was the first
But
explanation
internally
you
in the
offered.
government, the Pentagon and
maybe.
the CIA,
Right.
I know from when on occasion people give me classified documents, never enough, but when they do, I always look, oh, only secret? I want, top secret, good. What's the code word? What's
Right.
the special compartmented information? What's the part, how many people have access to this? So the more classified it is.
And a lot of times, I'm sure in those instances where you're doing your reporting, people classified them at a high level simply because they didn't want to be embarrassed by the decision making. Is that right?
Yes, very clearly, and it's on automatic pilot.
Right.
That's the problem. The classifications. Oh yeah, let's make this top secret. Now, why, with the press, in my view, doing a really excellent job covering the Trump administration and all parts of it, why does the public so distrust the press?
Look, this goes back to Watergate too. When you were doing the Watergate investigation, the press was held in very low esteem. Your efforts, your journalistic efforts, were viewed as partisan at the time. Nixon was attacking the press. His first vice president, Spiro Agnew, was the designated attack dog at the time. Approval ratings for the press were very low. And then over time, as it turned out, all of your reporting was validated, and then the approval ratings for the press went up after that point. So I think any time you're involved in covering things that can be perceived as partisan, not whether they are partisan, but whether they can be perceived as partisan, and whether you're viewed, just simply because of the reporting, you're viewed as having taken a side, whether you're for this tribe or that tribe, for this party or that party, then people will view you as, they won't trust you.
Yes, right. And as recently as several years ago, I did some stories and television picked them up and they said, oh, now Woodward and the Post are working for the Republican Party, or they're working for the, it's seen through a political lens, even by fellow reporters.
Absolutely. I think there's always an effort to sort of impute motives to us without really any evidence. But people want to characterize the reporting as partisan, in part to discredit the reporting. They may believe it's partisan, but they also may just want to discredit the reporting, have it not be believed. So it's portrayed that way.
So we have these episodes of kind of a avalanche of documents coming out, the Pentagon Papers, and then we have WikiLeaks. Are they the same?
I don't know. I think people would argue about that. The question is whether WikiLeaks constitutes a news organization. They like to describe themselves as a news organization. And in fact, preventing them from publishing would have implications for the press, or penalizing them for publication would have implications for the press. I think probably the more pertinent case now is the case of documents that were leaked by Edward Snowden.
Which the Post published, but very discreetly.
Yeah, I think we were very careful about which documents we published, and we didn't want to reveal sort of incredible detail about surveillance and things like that. But we did want to point out the level of surveillance, the overall level of surveillance that the government was really conducting.
What in the Snowden case, which again I think the Post did a great job on, what percentage of what you had or what was available to you did you publish? Do you know?
Oh, a very, very small percentage of that.
Why?
Absolutely. Why? Because the way that we evaluated was, is there a public interest in this? I mean, does this raise an issue that the public is entitled to debate? Does it represent, for example, an intrusion into people's privacy beyond which we were accustomed to or expected in this country? And in those instances, these were highly classified documents, the most classified documents in the U.S. government. But because of the Pentagon Papers case, the government did not have the right to bar us from publication. So there would be no prior restraint.
So you had, as Bradley would say, the high pair when you went to the government and said, hey, look, we've got all this. Now your critics would say, or critics of the press, well, who are you to decide what's in the public interest?
Right.
Who appointed you? And people who are actually quite moderate can get very testy about that.
I understand that argument, and I would say that the founders appointed us when they wrote the Constitution. They provided a role for the press, and the press's role has been adjudicated in court decisions over many decades now. So this is a pretty well-established law, and the Pentagon Papers case was absolutely central to that. Now, it's important to point out that the Pentagon Papers case allows us to go ahead and publish, but it doesn't necessarily protect us from the consequences of publication. If the government wants to go ahead and prosecute us, then it's certainly entitled to do so.
But what would they prosecute you for? Under what law?
This is referred to in the movie, and that is presumably under the Espionage Act is the likely area. Now, I think we would have a vigorous and very confident defense if that were the case. But look, the government right now is conducting loads of leak investigations. The Justice Department, under Attorney General Sessions, has announced that it has 3 times as many leak investigations ongoing as were occurring during the Obama administration.
Are you worried about that?
Well, I feel confident in what we did. We'll have to see where that ends up. But they may be just going after the leaker, but I suppose it's conceivable that they would try to come after us. I hope that's not the case. I don't think they should. I think that would be an effort to intimidate the press and would set a very bad precedent. But I think we'll just have to see how that shakes out.
What are the steps that can be taken on the road to restoring more trust with the press? I think that is a giant. People I talk to in the administration or in the government just say all we have to do is say fake news, and most people are not going to believe what you've done, or we've muddied the waters sufficiently that everything is doubted.
I think it's important to note that trust in basically all major institutions in this country has declined sharply, including in Congress, including in the presidency, including in big business, including in labor unions, you name it.
But that's not an excuse.
It's not an excuse, but it's just a matter of offering context. What can we do? I think that we can be much more transparent about how we go about our work, and that's what we've tried to do in our stories of late, is to explain much more about the reporting process. I think we can also talk more about who we are. I mean, people make this assumption that we're all from some sort of East Coast elite, but that's not the case at all. People come from all different...
There are 4 of us who aren't.
No, that's not true. There are many people who aren't. There are people who come from, middle America. They come from farms. They grew up in families that didn't have any substantial means. They had to work their way through college. They had all the same struggles that many Americans have today.
I wonder if tone isn't a problem also. That there often is, when you have a good story and so forth, you start feeling self-righteous, and there's a kind of smugness. And I think some of that leaks out, mostly on television, but I think it's a big problem with people who are looking at it and say, well, what's that? I was watching one of the cable shows this morning while exercising, and the woman running the show came on and something about Trump and said, if that doesn't make your stomach sick, this will, and that something Trump said, that people will do. And she actually said, well, only good people would not do that. And I blanched. I just thought.
Well, I do think that there's a tendency to describe the media as one entity.
Yes.
The reality is that there are a lot of us. So there are multiple networks, there are multiple news organizations of every type. They all have different traditions, histories, cultures, practices, all of that. It would be like saying all lawyers, all doctors, all teachers. The reality is that not everybody behaves the same, that each of us has our own way of doing things.
But somebody sees that on television. I mean, I don't think it's right for somebody running even a cable news show to say, doesn't that make your stomach sick?
Sure. Well, I'm not going to sit here and defend some cable
How
news
do we
show.
tamp that down, though?
Well, I don't know. I think that we have to take responsibility for our own news organizations and what we do. I think that I've always been, I always tell people that we need to be more impressed as journalists with what we don't know than with what we do know.
Amen.
Because there's so much that we don't know, and that's why we have to continuously do more and more reporting. When we've done the reporting, when we've done an enormous amount of research, when we've talked to everybody we should talk to, when we've looked at every document we should look at, sometimes that tells us what the story really is. As you know, you've reported those stories. And we have to publish those stories, even if the public is upset at publication.
Yes, I agree with that. You didn't know Katherine Graham at all,
I did not,
did
no.
you? May I tell a story
please.
about
tell
her?
us what she was like.
Because I did, and I started in September of '71, and Watergate was 9 months later. Carl Bernstein and I started working on it. And I had met Mrs. Graham, and she supported the stories we ran, but I didn't know her, and so one afternoon she invited me up for lunch. And so this is January '73, and we'd written these stories. They were not believed widely. We were denounced.
Right.
Somebody thought we'd gone off on some bender.
Right, people have forgotten that.
Yes, I mean, not just we were on the Metro staff. On the national staff, there was we were almost shunned of what have you done and what have you done to the reputation of the newspaper. So I went up for lunch with Katherine Graham, and here she'd had this real testing from the Pentagon Papers and came out on top. And she was strong, and she started asking me questions about Watergate. And quite honestly, she blew my mind with what she knew about Watergate. And at one point she said she was reading something about Watergate in the Chicago Tribune, and I thought, what the hell is she reading the Chicago Tribune for? No one in Chicago does, but here she was. No, that's a cheap shot. I'll take that back. But that was my thought, I'm being honest. And she scooped it in and had a leadership style, which I later described as mind on, hands off. She got all the information, but didn't tell us how to report or edit or what the subjects were. And so at one point in the lunch, she had the killer CEO question, which is, okay, when are we going to be vindicated? When's all the truth going to come out? And I said, well, because we'd go see people in this period after Nixon had won a massive landslide re-election, and they'd slam the doors more than they
in the middle of the Watergate investigation.
Yes,
won re-election. Right?
Yeah, yes, that's right. And that was, kind of Watergate. Whoever heard of that? We knew there was an organized cover-up. They were paying the Watergate burglars for their silence. The investigation by the Justice Department was being tamped down. And so I said, when's all the truth going to come out? I said, never. And I never forget her. And she looked at me with this kind of wounded look, and she said precisely, never? Don't tell me never. I left the lunch a highly motivated employee. But what she said, and we talked about it, she said it was not a threat, it was a statement of purpose. And she said, look, we've written these things about the president. we have a quadruple responsibility to get to the bottom of this. Keep going. And then she asked the wonderful question, why? And she answered her own question, which was, because that's the business we're in. I left that lunch. I was 29 at the time, thinking, wow, the boss gets it, is willing to take the risk to do what we think we have to do because that's the business we're in. And someday I think we ought to put a plaque in the lobby of the Washington Post with your approval that just begins, and we drill it in so no one can take it down. And it begin quote, never, don't tell me never, end quote. Katherine Graham,
Sure.
January 1973.
Sure.
Because that's a core, I know you well enough that maybe you don't use exactly that phraseology, but you in essence say, you know, we're not going to stop. No one's going to call us off.
And I think,
Don't tell me never.
Right.
Maybe we'll put the
that would be
plaque
fine,
outside
that would be
your
fine
office.
with me. Feel free. You can come with your hammer and nails, you know.
No, we want to drill it
okay,
in,
drill
as
it
I
in.
said. So no
that's fine. I mean, I think that's an important point there is that, you know, people try to judge reporting in the middle of the process.
Yes.
And reporting and journalism is a work in progress. And when you're doing an investigation, you don't know exactly where it's going to lead. What you need to do is continue to do reporting, answer the unanswered questions. Sometimes people don't want you to do the reporting to actually answer the unanswered questions. They would prefer you not, saying, well, those questions have not been answered, and stop there. But that's not journalism. Journalism is where we pursue the story as far as we can possibly pursue it, and that we don't stop. And you can't judge, I mean, in Watergate, as you pointed out, you know, people were dismissive of it. They weren't paying attention to it when they were voting during that election. In which Nixon was reelected. But ultimately, all of that work that you did and the Post did was validated. And, you know, I think that's important to remember in the present day.
Yes, and we were lucky, we were young, we were unmarried, but also we had Bradley and the other editors. And I often have thought about this, and this applies to you. Bradley was a great editor, not only because of what he put in the paper, but what he kept out of the paper. Where and it wasn't, he would delay stories. He'd say, it's not ready. Get more sources. I don't feel right about this. You know, maybe put a story inside that we thought should be on the front page. And he had this kind of 1 foot on the gas, 1 foot on the brake. And you go along and it's gas, brake, gas, brake. And that's what you have to do. You have to doubt everything.
We have to ask the toughest questions of our own work. And we should be doing that prior to publication rather than after the publication, right? And so, you know, that's the role of editors, is to ask their reporters about their stories, ask tough questions, be a proxy for the most critical member of the public. And, you know, that's what we do all the time. A lot of times stories are held up. We say we need more reporting. There are unanswered questions. Do we have the tone exactly right? We rework stories. And, you know,
and
that
the
is,
reporters sometimes resent it, don't they?
Sure, but that's an inherent tension, I think, that exists in a newsroom, and that's a good tension. You know, this kind of tension that makes something stronger. And, you know, and I think, you know, going back to the Pentagon Papers case, I mean, I think that case sort of inspired almost an era of investigative reporting.
Of course, the Pentagon Papers were not a result of investigative reporting. As my old colleague Carl Bernstein said, the Pentagon Papers, Daniel Ellsberg coming in with a grocery cart of documents.
Right, exactly.
And that's,
exactly.
you know, you wait and you pray for those moments.
But I think why it opened up an era of investigative reporting is that it inspired journalists to more freely challenge government and challenge authority. And that's at the essence of investigative reporting.
Yeah. And so what happens now? What's the bounce in the Trump administration?
I don't know. I think we have to wait and see. You know, I was just listening to you talk about Watergate and how, there were still so many unanswered questions. I feel that there are still many unanswered questions. I don't think we should stop. I think our job as journalists is to continue to report and to try to address the questions that are yet unanswered.
We haven't talked about the Catholic Church investigation, which at the Globe you were the instigator and driver of. Was there a point where somebody, the owners or the publisher or somebody said, you know, my God, we're in Boston and you're taking on the Catholic Church? Are you mad?
Well, it didn't happen that way, thankfully. I mean, our owner at the time was the New York Times Company, and they gave us an extraordinary degree of independence, for which I'm eternally grateful. You know, obviously, we were aware of how Catholic Boston is and was. We were concerned that there could be an enormous negative reaction against the Globe, but we also understood sort of what our responsibilities are, and I think that that's what has to prevail over any sort of fear about what the repercussions of our reporting is going to be, is that, you know, we have a responsibility, we have a mission as journalists. If we don't fulfill that mission, I honestly believe that the public will never forgive us. And I don't believe they should forgive us if we don't fulfill our mission. And so, yeah, there are risks all the time with the kind of reporting that we do. There are always worries about what the ramifications are going to be. Newspapers, for example, and television stations all across the country are often concerned about how the public and their community is going to react to a bit of investigative reporting. You know, how a major business might react, whether they're going to withdraw advertising, whether readers are going to boycott a news organization. But at the end of the day, we have to do our jobs. If we don't do our jobs, the public will know that, and they will feel correctly that we are not fulfilling our mission.
And so how much risk are you willing to take? I know in the case of Watergate, when I had that lunch with Katherine Graham, the reputation of the Post was floating in the toilet. Right at that time, there were challenges. We did not know right away, but later, challenges to the very valuable FCC licenses that the Post Company owned. So the stock was there floating in the toilet with the reputation. So here she had, you know, reputation, disbelief about this reporting, this sense of this is some sort of partisan crusade, the sense of the economic viability of the Post, its stock price, and so forth. And she said, quadruple the effort because that's the business we're in. Do you have the feeling now that the owner, Jeff Bezos of the Washington Post, understands that, as Bradley used to always say, you know, when it all turns out well, everyone feels good, but getting there can be sometimes quite painful?
Sure. I mean, I think, look, Jeff read the history of the Washington Post. As you know, he was an avid viewer of the Watergate hearings. He was
at
his
age
interest,
12 or 10.
Exactly. He used to watch it, I think, with his grandfather.
Yeah.
And it's one of the things that inspired him to acquire the Post in the first place. And so I think he has a deep appreciation for what's at stake, the kinds of pressures that one comes under when you're the owner of a news organization. But he also knows that we have a mission to fulfill. And so that he understands and wants us to fulfill our mission. You always come under pressure. I mean, look, during the Pentagon Papers case, there was also the concern about prosecution, also under the Espionage Act. And so, you know, and whenever we're publishing classified documents, or classified information, people have to be concerned about that because the government has an enormous power. And it has the enormous power to penalize, it has the enormous power to intimidate, and that's a scary thing. And I think the founders wanted to protect against that power. That's why they limited the powers of the executive branch and the powers of every branch of government. And that's why they created the press, the fourth estate, that's outside all those three branches of government, which is to hold all of them accountable. And so we understand that there are always going to be pressures, there are always going to be threats, there will always be concerns within our organization about what the repercussions might be. But at the end of the day, we have to take a look at what is our ultimate responsibility. And our ultimate responsibility is to the public, to tell the public what it says in our principles, to tell the public the truth as nearly as the truth may be ascertained.
But sometimes we get it wrong, not only the detail, but the overall. Somebody was interviewing me today about Reagan's Iran-Contra scandal. And if you look back at it, you realize that I did a book about it, and there was a secret internal White House investigation of Reagan, whether he knew about the illegal diversion of funds. And they brought in lawyers. They had 67 people working in secret on this, and looked at 200,000 documents and concluded there was no evidence that he did anything illegal. And if you go back and look, I mean, and before your time, we ran a story, not me, thankfully, on the front page of the Post saying Reagan may be indicted in the Iran-Contra scandal. And it was, you know, so far from the truth. We had it wrong, and there was a sense, I remember that atmosphere around Washington of, oh, Reagan's going to get impeached, he's going to have to resign, he did this, he did that. And it turns out, you know, Iran-Contra is a footnote in the Reagan histories.
Right, right. Well, you know that Phil Graham, Kay Graham's husband, talked about journalism as the first rough draft of history. And sometimes it can be a bit
rough.
A bit too rough. Look, we're human, right?
Yeah.
We're like people in any other profession. We're imperfect. We have our flaws. We make mistakes, just like everybody else in every other profession.
Are we good enough at admitting our mistakes and advertising them, do you think?
Well, I'm sure we can do better at that. So, you know, I mean, I think that people are, you know, we talked earlier about being more transparent, and obviously that is something that I think we need to work on.
In this friendly conversation, what's the biggest mistake you've made journalistically? No,
gee, I'd have to think about that, Bob.
Okay, well, I don't, because I know it was the Janet Cook, the reporter who said she had knew of an 8-year-old who was a heroin addict, and we ran a story on it. She won a Pulitzer Prize for a 42-paragraph story, and it turned out to be a fraud.
Right.
And we had to give the Pulitzer Prize back, and people were really... it was a dreary
no doubt.
time.
No doubt.
And Bradley was apoplectic and kind of, because he participated in the decision making, and the lesson from that for me was not just the journalistic problem, but it was almost a moral. It was a moral failure on my part to not think about the kid. If I come to you as a reporter now and I say, you know, there's a kid, 8 years old, who's being tortured and they hang him by his thumbs every day and give him heroin, what are you going to do?
Yeah.
You're going to say, okay, let's save the kid's life and then we'll do the story.
Right.
And we thought only of doing the story, and that I'm disappointed in myself.
Well, we all learn from our mistakes, and fortunately, you and the Post have been redeemed by subsequent great work.